The world knew them as the Spaceman and the Catman, two larger-than-life characters hidden beneath silver and white makeup, performing for millions under the blazing lights of the biggest stages rock and roll had ever seen. But backstage at Madison Square Garden on a freezing November night in 1979, Ace Frehley and Criss sat in a storage room surrounded by flight cases and coiled cables, sharing a bottle of Jack Daniels and making a decision that would shake the foundation of the most powerful band in rock history. What they agreed to that night wasn't just rebellion, it was sabotage, and the consequences would haunt Kiss for decades to come. By 1979, Kiss had conquered the world. The Dynasty album was climbing the charts. The merchandising empire was generating millions, and Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had transformed four guys from New York into a global phenomenon. But inside that success, a divide had been growing for years. On one side stood Gene and Paul, the architects and businessmen, the ones who controlled every decision from album artwork to tour routing. On the other side were Ace and Peter, the musicians who felt increasingly like employees rather than equal partners. The creative voices who once helped shape the Kiss sound were being drowned out by commercial calculations and corporate strategy. Ace noticed it first during the recording sessions for Love Gun in 1977. His guitar solos were being edited down. His song contributions were being pushed to album filler positions, while Gene and Paul dominated the A-sides. When he questioned the decisions, he was told that the producers knew best, that the business came first, that Kiss was bigger than any individual member. Peter experienced the same treatment with his drum parts, constantly being told to simplify, to play it safe, to remember that Kiss was a brand that couldn't afford experimental risks. Both men felt something slipping away, something essential that had made the band special in the beginning. If you've ever felt like your voice doesn't matter in a room where everyone else seems aligned, if you've watched your contributions get minimized while others take credit, then you understand the frustration that was building inside Ace Frehley and Criss. Before we go deeper into what happened that November night, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because the story we're about to tell has never been fully revealed until now. The documents, the testimony, the evidence of what these two outcasts planned will change how you see Kiss forever. The breaking point came during a band meeting in Los Angeles, 3 weeks before that fateful night in New York. Gene Simmons had called everyone together to discuss the next album, which would eventually become Unmasked. He and Paul had already worked out the entire concept, the song list, the producers, the sound they wanted. Ace and Peter sat there listening as their input was politely acknowledged, and then completely ignored. When Ace suggested bringing in a different producer, someone who understood the raw edge that made Kiss dangerous in the early days, Gene shut him down with a single sentence that burned into both musicians' minds. "We're not looking for dangerous anymore, Ace. We're looking for platinum." Peter excused himself first, walking out before the meeting ended. Ace followed 10 minutes later. They found each other in the hotel bar, both ordering whiskey, both knowing without speaking that something had fundamentally broken. Peter was the one who said it out loud. "They don't want us anymore. They want what we represent, the image, the characters, but they don't want us." Ace nodded slowly, watching the amber liquid in his glass catch the dim bar light. "So what do we do about it?" That question hung in the air for days. Both men knew they were trapped in a golden cage. Walking away from Kiss meant walking away from millions of dollars, from worldwide fame, from an identity that had consumed their lives for nearly 7 years. But staying meant accepting that they were replaceable parts in a machine that Gene and Paul controlled absolutely. The resentment festered during rehearsals, during sound checks, during the endless promotional appearances where they smiled for cameras while dying inside. The Dynasty Tour rolled into New York on November 12, 1979. Kiss was playing 4 sold-out nights at Madison Square Garden, returning as conquering heroes to the city where they'd started. For Ace, playing New York always stirred complicated emotions. This was home, the Bronx streets where he'd learned guitar, the clubs where Kiss had ground out their early reputation. Now he was returning as Space Ace, a cartoon character in a silver suit, playing songs he barely recognized as his own creation. Peter felt the same disconnection, the same sense that the real people behind the makeup had been erased. After the second night's show, while Gene and Paul attended a record label party at Studio 54, Ace and Peter slipped away. They found that storage room, a forgotten corner of the Garden's labyrinth backstage where no one would look for them. Peter brought the Jack Daniels. Ace brought the guitar he'd been playing since the Alive album, the worn Les Paul that felt more real to him than anything else in his life at that moment. They sat on equipment cases, passing the bottle, and Peter finally asked the question that had been building for weeks. What if we just stopped playing along? Ace looked at him, understanding immediately what Peter meant. Not quitting, not walking away, but something more subtle and more dangerous. A quiet rebellion from inside the machine. What did you have in mind? Peter's answer was simple but devastating. We give them exactly what they want. Nothing more. No extra takes in the studio. No overtime on rehearsals. We show up, we do the minimum, we collect the check, and we start working on our own stuff on the side. Solo material. Songs they can't control. If they want employees instead of partners, that's what they'll get. But we start building our exit strategy. What started as angry venting evolved into detailed planning over the next 2 hours. Ace and Peter made specific agreements about how they would operate within Kiss moving forward. In the studio, they would record their parts efficiently, but without the passion and experimentation that had previously elevated Kiss tracks. No more marathon sessions trying to nail the perfect solo or the perfect drum fill. If the producers wanted safe and commercial, they'd get competent and forgettable. During interviews, they would say the right things about band unity, while subtly expressing their individual identities, planting seeds for eventual solo careers. But the most significant part of the pact was what they agreed to do outside of Kiss obligations. Both men committed to secretly developing solo material, using their Kiss downtime to write and record songs that showcased their actual musical abilities, rather than the simplified versions that fit the Kiss formula. Ace had already been toying with ideas that were bluesier and more guitar-focused than anything Kiss would release. Peter wanted to explore the R&B and soul influences that had shaped his drumming before the band's hard rock direction consumed everything. They shook hands in that storage room, sealing an alliance that felt both liberating and terrifying. Neither man fully understood the consequences of what they'd agreed to. They were essentially sabotaging Kiss from within, deliberately withholding the full commitment that had made the band special, while using Kiss resources and fame to build their individual futures. It was betrayal disguised as self-preservation. And deep down, both Ace and Peter knew that Gene and Paul would never forgive them if the truth came out. The effects of the pact became visible almost immediately, though Gene and Paul initially didn't recognize what was happening. During the unmasked recording sessions in early 1980, Ace showed up on time, recorded his guitar parts competently, and left. No arguments about song selection. No pushing for his compositions to get better placement. No hours spent perfecting solos that would be mixed down anyway. Paul actually commented to the producer that Ace seemed more professional, more focused. What Paul didn't realize was that Ace was saving his energy and creativity for the solo tracks he was recording at a different studio on his days off. Peter adopted the same approach with his drum parts. He played what was required. Nothing fancy, nothing risky. When the producers asked for changes, he made them without debate. Gene interpreted this as Peter finally accepting his role in the band's commercial direction. The truth was that Peter had mentally checked out, counting down the sessions until he could work on the material that actually excited him, the songs where his voice and style would be central rather than secondary. The other aspect of the Pact involved subtly undermining Gene and Paul's authority in small, deniable ways. Ace began arriving exactly on time rather than early, technically fulfilling his obligations while sending a message about his reduced investment. Peter started agreeing with everything in band meetings, while privately mocking the decisions to crew members and session musicians. They created an atmosphere of passive resistance that was frustrating but hard to directly confront. The Pact held for almost 8 months, through the completion and release of Unmasked, through the following tour dates, through countless interviews and appearances, where Ace and Peter maintained their professional facades while secretly working on exit strategies. But secrets in the music industry rarely stay hidden forever, especially when money and ego are involved. The unraveling began when a session musician who'd worked on some of Ace's solo recordings mentioned the project to a Kiss crew member, thinking it was common knowledge. That crew member mentioned it to the tour manager, and the tour manager, loyal to Gene and Paul, reported it directly to them. Gene Simmons confronted Ace in a hotel room in Chicago on August 3, 1980. The conversation started calmly, but escalated quickly when Gene realized that Ace had been systematically planning a solo career while still contracted to Kiss. "You've been phoning it in," Gene said, his voice cold with controlled anger. "For months, you've been giving us leftovers while saving your best work for yourself." Ace didn't deny it. He was tired of hiding, tired of pretending. "You wanted an employee," he shot back. "You got one. Everything in my contract, nothing more. If you don't like it, maybe you should have treated us like partners instead of hired help." The same confrontation happened between Paul and Peter later that week. Paul was even more hurt than Gene, taking the secret solo work as a personal betrayal of their shared history. Peter tried to explain the years of feeling diminished, of watching his contributions get minimized, of being treated as replaceable. But Paul heard it as excuses, as justification for disloyalty. The fundamental divide that had led to the Pact in the first place made reconciliation impossible. Both sides had legitimate grievances, but neither could see past their own perspective. By late 1980, the situation had become unsustainable. Ace and Peter's Pact had achieved its goal of giving them independence and leverage, but it had also poisoned the band's chemistry beyond repair. Gene and Paul knew they couldn't fire both members without risking Kiss's image and commercial momentum, but they also couldn't continue working with musicians who were actively undermining the band's direction. The solution, when it emerged, satisfied no one but seemed inevitable. A gradual transition where Ace and Peter would be eased out while replacement members were secretly auditioned. What Ace and Peter didn't know until much later was that Gene and Paul had made their own pact in response. They agreed that Kiss was bigger than any individual member, including themselves if necessary, and that the makeup concept allowed for replacement without destroying the brand. The Spaceman and the Catman could be played by anyone, This realization, which would have devastated Ace and Peter if they'd understood it in 1980, represented Gene and Paul's ultimate revenge for the secret alliance and sabotage. The irony was that both sides' tactics achieved the opposite of their intentions. Ace and Peter's pact was meant to preserve their dignity and creative freedom while remaining in Kiss. Instead, it accelerated their departure and gave Gene and Paul justification for replacing them. Gene and Paul's hardline business approach was meant to strengthen Kiss by maintaining control. Instead, it drove away two founding members whose presence and personalities had been essential to the band's original appeal, leading to years of lineup instability and creative decline. Ace Frehley officially left Kiss in 1982, though his participation had been minimal for over a year. Peter Criss departed even earlier in 1980, shortly after the confrontation with Paul. Both men pursued solo careers with mixed success, never quite recapturing the magic they'd helped create in Kiss's golden era. The pact they'd made in that Madison Square Garden storage room had given them temporary power, but cost them their place in rock history's most successful band. Gene and Paul, meanwhile, continued Kiss for decades with various replacement members, proving that the brand was indeed bigger than any individual. But longtime fans always knew something essential had been lost when the original four broke apart. The full story of the Pact remained hidden for years, with all four original members giving different versions in interviews and memoirs. Gene and Paul portrayed Ace and Peter as unreliable and uncommitted. Ace and Peter described Gene and Paul as controlling tyrants. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either narrative. Two creative musicians felt diminished and disrespected, so they formed an alliance to protect themselves and their futures. Two business-minded leaders felt betrayed and sabotaged by partners they'd trusted. Both sides made decisions that seemed justified at the time, but contributed to destroying something that could never be rebuilt. Looking back now, 4 decades later, the 1979 pact between Ace Frehley and Peter Criss stands as a cautionary tale about ego, control, and the fragility of creative partnerships. It shows how resentment, when left unaddressed, metastasizes into actions that damage everyone involved. It demonstrates how success can paradoxically destroy the very relationships that created that success. And it reminds us that even the mightiest empires in rock and roll are built on human foundations that can crack under pressure. The storage room where Ace and Peter shook hands and agreed to their secret rebellion no longer exists. Madison Square Garden has been renovated multiple times since 1979. But the consequences of that November night echo through Kiss's entire history. A hidden turning point that changed everything while being invisible to the millions of fans who only saw the spectacle on stage. Sometimes the most significant moments in rock history happen in forgotten rooms, with just 2 people and a bottle of whiskey, making decisions that will reverberate for decades.